It began not with confidence, but with arithmetic. In July 1918, Germany's generals could count as well as anyone. Nearly 1 million Americans were already in France, and more were landing every week. If the war continued into 1919, Allied manpower and industry would dwarf anything the Central Powers could field. Erich Ludendorff, the dominant figure in Germany's high command, drew a ruthless conclusion: strike at once, strike hard, and force a decision before the balance became irreversible. He chose the Marne, the river that had checked Germany in 1914, to be the river that would redeem 1918. If fortune favored him a blow, there could split the French from the British, threaten Paris, and shatter a fragile coalition. If fortune did not, well, even gamblers know the table turns against those who wait. Yet the wager rested on a nation frayed to threads. 4 years of blockade and mobilization had scoured the German home front. In Berlin, women lined up before dawn for bread that shrank by the week. Coal ran short. Winters were hungry and cold. Malnourished children coughed through school lessons. Factory workers fainted at their machines. Newspapers, thin with rationed paper, carried official optimism beside private resignation. Letters filtered to the front, like a dirge pantry's bare-pawned wedding rings, a sick child who needed milk. Soldiers read them in dugouts and tucked them away, then read them again by candlestub. The army mirrored the strain. Uniforms hung loosely on men whose cheeks had hollowed from thin rations. Boots were patched until nothing remained to patch. Veterans bore Verdun's and the Somme's old scars. Replacements were ever younger, 16, 17 hands shaking on rifles that still felt like plows or pen shafts. Stormtrooper battalions, the spearheads of the spring offensives, were formidable in training, but diminished in flesh and morale. A Bavarian private scribbled what many felt they were being pushed on like cattle, not toward victory, but toward necessity. Still, Ludendorff believed the Allies brittle. France had endured mutinies in 1917, Britain had bled in Flanders and Passchendaele, Italy had been broken at Caporetto before recovering on the Piave, and the Americans, brave perhaps but green. He summoned 20-plus divisions for what Berlin styled Operation Marne-Reims Hammerhard near Reims, to draw French reserves eastward, then smash across the Marne further west for the main thrust toward Paris. 4 years earlier, Paris had been saved by taxicabs ferrying troops to the front. In 1918, he meant the capital to field German guns again. What his plan underestimated was how thoroughly the Allies had learned. French aerial reconnaissance traced new roads and camouflage dumps like veins across a map. Wireless intercepts yielded fragments of timetables and intent. A captured briefcase supplied confirmation more damning than any deduction. Ferdinand Foch, elevated to Allied Supreme Command in the spring's worst hours, chose a counterintuitive response: resist the urge to contest the North Bank, let the enemy cross and kill him where the terrain and logistics made him most vulnerable. If the Germans came over the river, they would come into pre-registered guns and hidden machine guns with a river at their back. Discipline would do the rest. Along the southern bank, French and American units rewrote the opening chapter. Engineers erected dummy batteries and false trenches to siphon shell fire. Real positions sank into woods and reverse slopes. Observation balloons sprouted like pale fruit over Allied lines, tethered to telephones that fed coordinates to batteries already laid on likely crossing points. In the hedgerows, riflemen and gun crews rehearsed the unnatural order that would demand everything of their nerves wait. Night after night they did. The river carried sounds, hammer blows on pontoon timbers. A splash, a barked order hushed to a whisper. Men crouched in root-scented darkness, bayonets greased to keep them from glinting, listening to the enemy assemble. It was like watching a nightmare approach, an American later recalled, and being told not to wake until its hands were on your throat. Before the infantry moved, the guns spoke. On Bastille night and into July 15th, the German bombardment opened, with a grandeur only industry can supply: high explosive to shatter and bury shrapnel, to rake what fled gas, to creep into lungs and cellars. Champagne's vineyards and the villages along the Marne vanished beneath concussion and dust. Civilians fled by cart and foot. The living flowed away from the front, while new battalions marched toward it. But down in deepened shelters, many Allied frontliners endured what earlier in the war would have annihilated them. They could not know what dawn would bring, only that they were still alive to see it. The plan's logic was simple, its risk colossal. If the Allies mistimed their fire, or the Germans secured a solid bridgehead, the road to Paris could reopen like a wound. But if patience held and steel was applied at the crossing, the river that had saved France in 1914 could become the river that broke Germany in 1918. On July 15th, stormtroopers rushed pontoons toward Blackwater. Officers promised Paris lay only days ahead. Columns splashed across while the far bank kept its counsel. Appearances deceived. The quiet was a blade being honed. Within hours, the Marne would no longer be a river to be crossed, but an obstacle to the living and a tomb to the dead. The last throw had been made. The table was about to speak. The Germans believed they were advancing into weakness. They were advancing into a plan. For weeks, Allied intelligence had been piecing together a mosaic of intent photographs, stitched into panoramas, snatches of code, the telltale geometry of railheads and bridging parks. What the mosaic showed was a familiar ambition in a new season. Foch elected to answer not with a preemptive blow, but with the colder economy of a trap. He built it in layers. The forward line would be held lightly tripwire posts and outguards, whose duty was not to die in place but to signal the storm and fall back. Behind them, positions on reverse slopes masked by hedgerows and copses hid machine guns whose beaten zones were already plotted down to paces. Artillery lay still, barrels camouflaged, and trails spiked into earth already surveyed to the yard, where German aerial eyes might see the Allies planted deception dummy guns of timber and paint trenches that led nowhere, a scatter of livestock in abandoned streets to suggest habitation. The true teeth of the defense were pulled back from obvious ground, ready to bite only when the jaw closed. Intelligence kept tightening the vice. Balloon observers floated in wicker baskets, studying the north bank through long glasses and telephoning corrections in a clipped mechanical chant. Sound-ranging crews triangulated hostile batteries. Flash-spotting teams marked howitzer mouths when night fire betrayed them. French wireless operators wrote down more than they could decode, then guessed the rest. One captured German officer removed all need to guess. The Allies knew where the Germans would step before they lifted their feet. Foch's instructions to subordinates were both severe and minimalist. Do not reveal, do not interrupt the crossing, do not squander fire on what is still upstream. When the Marne is full, empty it. He trusted calculation more than bravado. To many officers at the front, the trust looked like hazard. Letting an enemy across meant inviting him into your house. But the house was wired and the furniture nailed to the floor. The planners were wagering that Germany's spring spearheads had dulled enough to break when struck, that supply columns were already straining, that the vaunted stormtroop tempo relied on a well of strength that had been sunk too shallow. For the men crouched by the river, the arithmetic did not make the waiting easier. The night before the assault stretched rubber tight. They smelled creosote on fresh timbers and cigarette smoke on damp wind. They heard a pontoon scrape stone and a whisper turn into a command. Fingers cramped around triggers they were not yet allowed to pull. We could hear them, as if they were in the same room a private would write. My heart beat so loud I thought it would give us away. Above them, balloons swayed against stars. Below them, moles and men shared earth. Shortly before midnight, the prelude began, an orchestration of chemicals and fragmentation across a 40-mile front. The Allies' first defense was the physics of gas and the mathematics of fortification. Mustard clung to low places, but many men were in lower places than the gas could reach, and masks waited near hands. Quiet telephones ticked from balloon to battery, "Keep your fire." The defenders endured the percussion, counting seconds between salvos and feeling the ground drum through wooden bunks. Where the deception worked, German gunners chewed at empty facades and wooden guns. Where it did not, dugouts paid the old price, splintered timbers, throat sting the panic of darkness and falling earth. Then the barrage lifted, as it always lifted, and the assault waves shuffled toward River Sound. Bridging units shoved pontoons into the current. Officers repeated the catechism. Hurry, fix bayonets, keep rifles high. The bank is clear, the French are broken, Paris is near. On the southern shore, nothing answered except the river on stone. Some German companies were already across when a single crack from the tree line snapped the silence. A second crack, a third. What followed was not improvisation, it was release. Dozens of Allied machine gun teams fired at once, cutting lanes across the pontoons and the slippery mud of the far bank. The first traverses found targets already mapped, where men bunched at the waterline arcs overlapped. Where they tried to scatter artillery, introduced them to coordinates measured days earlier. Shells began seeking the river itself. Planks leaped, bodies did the same, and then did not. In the command posts, officers listened to the stopwatch precision of barrages walking forward, and felt that private amazement soldiers sometimes feel in a successful ambush, that something planned on paper could enter the world so exactly. Foch's hazard had been to let the enemy come close enough to hurt. His discipline had been to trust his guns to make that hurt fatal. The trap did not end the battle, it ended the illusion under which the Germans had begun it, that they were attacking a brittle front that time could be bullied into stopping. The river had been opened to them and then closed over them. The jaws were set. The hammer would fall next. At midnight on July 15th, the sky erupted as if the firmament had been wired to blow. German batteries along the Marne and across Champagne howitzers in orchards, field guns behind hedgerows, long-range pieces sighted on chalk opened in sequence until thunder became a continuous medium, and silence an idea men could no longer remember. Village streets atomized, church bells crashed, harvest fields leapt into flame. The barrage was less a line of guns than an industry working at maximum output: chemistry, metallurgy, logistics, and drill transmuted into concussion and splinters. High explosive pulverized walls and timbers into lethal dust. Airburst shrapnel, scythed trenches with steel balls that pattered like hail and killed like sleet. Gas shells burst in a sickly hush, their contents invisible and efficient mustard to blister any skin it touched and burn the lungs of those who breathed its vapor, phosgene to turn breath into drowning. Men jerked awake into masks and darkness, counting heartbeats while the lids of dugouts sifted dirt into their hair. Groans mingled with the asthmatic rasp of filters. For civilians in cellars, the world narrowed to plaster dust and choked whispers. For soldiers underground, it narrowed to resolve measured minute by minute. This time, much of that violence struck targets chosen for it to strike. Dummy works drank shell after shell. Forward posts held by skeleton crews pulled back as ordered. Most of the living waited deeper than most of the killing. The difference between 1916 and 1918 could be measured in yards of earth and months of intelligence lessons absorbed from Verdun, and the Chemin des Dames were being paid forward. When the guns lifted, many of the men who were supposed to be dead stood up in the smoke and gripped their weapons tighter. Assault whistles shrilled. Stormtrooper groups, lightly burdened, expensively trained, moved like ink into cracks. Grenadiers, Lewis gun teams, men with flame tubes and wire cutters. Engineers manhandled pontoons, boots slipping on wet planks as officers hissed urgency. The river took them in, as rivers take in both swimmers and the doomed without comment. On the south bank, the tree line kept its counsel. The quiet looked like collapse. It was concentration. A rifle shot broke it, then another, then a phenomenon common to battle and rare anywhere else, many weapons speaking so nearly at once that the ear receives a single word, made of metal. Machine guns opened along hedges, and from foxholes sighted to rake not only the near bank, but the water itself. Paddle wheels of bullets chewed the pontoons, while direct fire guns, already laid, began stitching the current with bursts. Men who had reached the shallows dropped where they stood. Those halfway across tried to crouch behind the slight geometry of planking and found there is no cover on water. Artillery took its turn. Fire orders that had been tested and retested marched shells onto crossing points, first the near approaches, then the river, then the slopes where those who made it up would try to breathe. Water lifted in geysers, planks became kindling, bodies tried to become logs and failed. Some soldiers doffed packs to swim and discovered that bayonets and boots were weights enough. Those who crawled ashore met the second act, intersecting arcs of fire that punished any movement and punished stillness with the next barrage. We crossed believing we were victors, a Saxon officer's diary would be found to say. Now we dig into the bank like hunted animals. A few bridgeheads formed because men will cling to any ground that is not water. They scratched out foxholes and prayed for guns to join them. Liaison faltered. Runners fell, flares dissolved in smoke. Officers shouted orders that became pantomime. The Americans of the 3rd Division, new to Europe, not new to discipline, held by Chateau Thierry, with a stubbornness that would rename them the Rock of the Marne. French units along adjacent sectors matched that resolve with the practiced steadiness of survivors. Their fire was not furious so much as relentless. By evening, the reckoning was already terrible. Thousands lay in the river or by it. Hundreds of animals that should have hauled guns lay tangled in traces. The ground smelled of cordite, damp wool, and opened earth. The assault had not ceased everywhere that would take days, but the promise under which it had begun collapsed in hours. The river that was supposed to speed a breakthrough had become a machine of attrition, fed by courage and producing loss. For the Allies, the night confirmed that patience and preparation can be strategy, not hesitation. For the Germans, it offered a first glimpse of the most demoralizing truth. A soldier can learn that even bravery has no leverage against physics once the terms are wrong. The sky had fallen, the river had risen, the battle had truly begun. Beyond the trench maps, people lived where armies fought. In July 1918, that meant towns like Dormans-Epernay and Château-Thierry waking to concussions that tore roofs away like paper. It meant parents finding children by touch in the dark. It meant the oldest decision in war: flee or stay, made under a rain of tile and glass. Roads filled in minutes with carts stacked in haste mattresses, tied with rope, a cradle wedged between a churn and a trunk, with automobiles that coughed, ran, and then died for lack of fuel, with cattle driven alongside families, and then abandoned when the shells bracketed the road. The flow of the living split soldiers toward the front, civilians away from it, meeting at crossroads where neither had the right of way and both had the need. Those who stayed went underground. Cellars, crypts, culvert spaces meant for wine or bone or water became refuge. The air turned to chalk and candle smoke. Mothers pressed palms to mouths to dampen a child's panicked noise. Old men fingered rosaries in darkness that smelled of damp stone and fear. Each pause in the barrage brought a muttered inventory: who was with them, who was missing, what could still be carried if they ran. When the guns spoke again, conversation ceased, but not prayer. Symbols burned with houses. Reims Cathedral, already a martyred skeleton from earlier years, took more punishment. Glass that had survived centuries fell in colored weather. Charred rafters made the nave a black-ribbed thing under gray sky. The ruin mattered beyond the stone. To French eyes, it was not only status destroyed, but continuity wounded. Yet the walls remained pitted, scorched upright. Treated as monument and patient, the cathedral stood and absorbed, stood and accused. Water and food dropped from necessity to hazard. Wells were fouled by corpse and shrapnel. Ration lines were broken by shell bursts. Bakeries that had sweetened mornings exhaled only smoke. When the guns paused, people spilled into orchards and fields to glean what could be gleaned: apples bruised, but edible spilled grain, a chicken more frightened than they were. Sniper fires startled harvesters back into ditches. Gas made some hedgerows poison. Human impulses endured in defiance. A widow who had carried letters for a company captain before the last evacuation carried them again to his replacement. A farmer went back into a field, cratered like a beehive, and planted a line of seed because autumn would come if he did, and only if he did. Children who had been so quiet in cellars ran briefly in courtyards, between shells, laughter arriving like rain showers, unexpected, brief, precious, uninvited, and unforbidden. Soldiers noted these things because they could not note them. Americans wrote home about a glass of wine pressed into a shaking hand with a mercy from someone whose house no longer had a roof. French troops wrote of a woman who gave them eggs from chickens living under her bed because the henhouse was gone. German diaries recorded unease in billets, looted cellars, hurried meals in kitchens that would be rubble by morning, a sense that the land itself disapproved. By month's end, many places had lost their names to rubble. Streets that had carried market carts carried only dust. Champagne's vines, pride and livelihood, lay cut, trampled, gassed. Families returned to walls and found that walls were all. There were no beds, no clocks, no doors, only a square of sunlight falling where a roof had been. The Second Battle of the Marne would be remembered for maneuvers and orders of battle, but those who lived by the river remembered it differently, as catastrophe measured in rooms in wells, in the sound of glass, and in the long quiet after a house has fallen. The Marne's south bank was not held by French hands alone. By July 1918, the American Expeditionary Forces were no longer a promise, but a presence, divisions with names and numbers, rifles oiled and packs too heavy, officers with maps in languages they were still learning to pronounce. They had crossed an ocean under the threat of U-boats trained under French and British tutors, whose lessons came from trenches rather than textbooks, and discovered that the smell of Europe in wartime was mud cordite and horse. In June, the United States Marines had written themselves into French memory at Belleau Wood, charging through wheat flayed by machine guns, and clearing a forest tree by tree at the cost of almost 10,000 casualties. Germans called them devils. In July, it was the Army's turn to do an older and duller work hold ground. The 3rd Division anchored a sector near Château-Thierry that would earn it a new name, Rock of the Marne, not because the line was easy to hold, but because men who might have moved did not. Inexperience showed in the small things and in the fatal ones. Some companies advanced too visibly and learned quickly what a Maxim can cut. Some platoons bunched in communicating trenches and learned about airbursts. Some men fumbled gas masks in the first seconds and discovered that seconds matter more than courage. Training camp instruction in Kansas or Pennsylvania had been thorough for a different war. This one taught on contact. A private wrote home and did not send the letter. The ground shook like a living thing. The noise arrived through bone, and the best advice veterans offered was practical. Keep moving when you should, keep still when you must. Don't look long at the worst of what you will see. What the Americans brought that could not be taught was energy that did not know yet how tired armies move. New boots, new rifles, new appetites, mail sacks that were full, an assumption that this could be finished by effort if effort were applied. French soldiers, gaunt, precise in their motions, fluent in economy, looked at the newcomers with a complicated affection, envy for their strength, worry for their impetuosity, gratitude for their arrival. British units, veterans of slaughter, recognized in them not naivety alone, but momentum, the thing every coalition needs when history has been tugging backward for too long. Germany noticed. Assault groups that had bullied brittle sectors met battalions that closed sooner than expected and pressed harder than wise. At Soissons later in the month, American divisions charged ridgelines in tempo that burned their own strength, as well as the enemy's not efficient, often costly, sometimes decisive. Ludendorff would later concede what officers at the front had already seen: the American presence changed the mathematics and the mood. If the Allies lost 1,000 men, they could be replaced. If Germany did, it could not. The cost for the United States was immediate and intimate. Aid stations filled with boys who, a spring earlier, had been learning trades or filing at desks. Nurses, American, British, French cutaway uniforms that had not yet lost their dye to trench water. Chaplains learned Midwestern names and prayers in French churches open to the sky. Medics wrote last letters because hands that could hold a rifle could not hold a pen for long. The words that crossed the Atlantic, carefully phrased by censors and honestly read by families, were the currency by which a distant war became a local bereavement. And yet the line held, and not only held, but pushed. Along the Marne, American machine gunners learned to wait until pontoons were full before firing. Riflemen learned to shoot at water because men must come out of it. Companies learned that digging is as heroic as charging if it means being alive to fire tomorrow. When the counterstroke came, American divisions moved with French tanks, as if they had always done it, learning under fire the choreography of combined arms. Let the armor eat the wire, and the strong point. Follow close enough to keep up, but far enough not to be crushed by what falls from the sky. In the short span of a month, the doughboys ceased to be a rumor and became part of a rhythm, one more instrument in an orchestra that, when it played in time, could move the front faster than any single arm. They did not save France by themselves. France had been saving herself for 4 years, but they helped make it possible for salvation to become victory. And in that work they spent youth freely, because youth does not yet know how rare it is. The Second Battle of the Marne was more than a clash of men and maneuvers. It was the fullest expression yet of industrial war. By 1918, the battlefield had become an experiment in destruction, where science and industry collaborated to turn the countryside into a laboratory of killing. The armies that faced each other along the Marne fought not only with rifles and bayonets, but with a grim orchestra of machines, chemicals, and firepower that left the land itself mutilated. Artillery reigned as the chief executioner. In this battle, as in so many of the war, more than half of all casualties came from shells fired by men who never saw their targets. German gunners opened the offensive with millions of rounds, hurled in a calculated sequence of devastation, high explosive to collapse trenches and shatter dugouts, shrapnel shells to scatter their deadly iron rain, and gas canisters to seep into every hollow. The noise was ceaseless, not merely heard but felt as vibration through soil and bone. Soldiers wrote that the sound itself seemed intent on breaking the mind. But the Allies had learned to make artillery not merely destructive but precise. Observation balloons hovered like tethered ghosts, their crews telephoning coordinates directly to batteries. Reconnaissance planes circled overhead, their cameras recording in strips of photographs the locations of German reserves and bridging equipment. Sound ranging stations triangulated enemy fire, allowing counter barrages to find their mark with mathematical accuracy. When German pontoons crowded with men floated into the current, Allied gunners did not guess at where to aim. They already knew. A single salvo could splinter an entire crossing, flinging grey uniformed bodies into the river to vanish under their own heavy packs. Gas remained a constant haunting presence. Mustard gas, oily and persistent, lingered for days in shell holes, poisoning any man who stumbled through. Its victims suffered blistered skin, blinded eyes, and lungs that burned with every breath. Chlorine and phosgene came in drifting clouds, unseen but unmistakable once they filled a trench. Men lived in dread of the faintest unusual smell, of the breeze shifting suddenly, of a forgotten gas mask drill. At night we woke choking. One American corporal wrote, not knowing if it was smoke or if it was death. The fear was as potent as the substance, for even a rumor of gas could spread panic through an entire company. If the guns and gas were the storm, the machine gun was the scythe. Positioned to command open fields and riverbanks, the German MG 808 and the French Chauchat alike turned courage into futility. Whole waves of infantry could be stopped by a single well-placed nest. Men advancing across wheat fields learned that speed was no shield. Bullets cut them down in lines so neat they seemed arranged by some cruel order. When the Germans tried to expand their bridgeheads on July 15th, Allied gunners waited until pontoons were fully laden before opening fire. Within minutes, the river boiled, with men collapsing mid-stride pontoons, shattering under the relentless hammer of automatic fire. But by 1918, new machines were beginning to shift the balance. Tanks, ungainly clanking beasts of steel, entered the battle in numbers. The French Renault FT, small and nimble, advanced in swarms, its cannon and machine gun, silencing nests that had defied infantry for years. British heavy tanks, slower but terrifying, crushed wire and trenches beneath their massive treads. For German infantry, the sight of these armored monsters emerging from the smoke was like an apparition. Rifle bullets pinged harmlessly off their plates. Their advance seemed inexorable. Many broke down in the mud, others were destroyed by direct artillery hits, but those that kept moving carried infantry behind them into ground once thought impregnable. Above the battlefield, the war in the air reached new heights. Reconnaissance planes guided artillery with flares and radios. Bombers swooped low to scatter fragmentation bombs on troop concentrations and bridges. Fighters engaged in spirals of death, their wooden canvas wings fragile against the hammer of synchronized machine guns. For the soldiers in the trenches, the drone of engines overhead became another sound of dread, for it meant that the sky itself was hostile. Together, these weapons reshaped not just the battle, but the land. Fields of wheat became seas of craters, villages were pulverized into anonymous rubble, and forests were reduced to splintered stumps. Survivors described landscapes where no birds sang, where no trees stood, where the air itself stank of cordite and gas. A French corporal wrote, "We fought bravely, but it was not bravery that decided. It was the shells, the machines, the fire that never ceased. We were like leaves in a gale, blown wherever the storm wished." The Second Battle of the Marne was a turning point, not only because of strategy, but because of the arsenal that made strategy possible. It was the first great battle where all the instruments of modern combined arms, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and infantry, played together in a symphony of destruction. It was proof that industrial war had become its own engine, grinding armies, civilians, and landscapes alike beneath its iron wheels. While the Germans struggled to secure footholds across the Marne in the west, another storm was breaking to the east around the ancient city of Reims. Here stood the French Fourth Army, under General Henri Gouraud, a commander who knew intimately both the cruelty of war and the necessity of endurance. Gouraud, who had lost his right arm years before at Gallipoli, had turned his personal maiming into a symbol of resolve. His men drew strength from his example. On July 15, 1918, they would need every ounce of it. The German assault on Reims was never meant to achieve a decisive breakthrough. It was designed to deceive. Ludendorff believed that if he struck with sufficient fury against the eastern sector, the French would rush reserves to Champagne, leaving the true axis of advance across the Marne vulnerable. But diversions are paid for in blood just as surely as main offensives, and the soldiers on both sides of the lines around Reims bore the cost. At dawn, the German artillery opened a torrent of fire across the chalk ridges and vineyard country east of the city. The bombardment rivaled anything seen at Verdun. High explosive shells plowed deep furrows in the earth, collapsing dugouts and trench lines. Gas canisters hissed as they burst, releasing clouds of mustard that settled into gullies and cellars, making every low place into a trap of its own. Villages were engulfed in flames. Whole neighborhoods of Reims shook under the hammering of heavy guns. For civilians who had endured years of intermittent shelling, this was the worst yet. Families huddled in crypts beneath shattered churches, clutching rosaries, whispering prayers, while masonry dust fell like snow from the vaulted ceilings. When the guns lifted, German stormtroopers surged forward. These were among the Reich's most seasoned men, armed with light machine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers. They moved quickly, slipping through smoke and debris, exploiting every gap. At first, their progress seemed unstoppable. Outposts were overrun, forward trenches captured, and French defenders cut down or forced back in chaos. Reports filtered to German headquarters of breakthroughs and fleeing French. For a few hours, it looked as if the deception might turn into something greater. But Gouraud had prepared with a strategist's patience. Drawing on lessons learned at Verdun, he had adopted defense in depth on a scale rarely seen before. His front lines were thinly manned, designed to absorb the first blow and then yield. Behind them, hidden batteries and machine guns awaited their positions, carefully sighted on reverse slopes invisible to German reconnaissance. Dummy trenches and fake gun emplacements had lured much of the bombardment onto empty ground. The real defenses lay miles behind, silent and intact. As German stormtroopers pressed forward, they outpaced their artillery support and plunged into a zone carefully prepared to destroy them. Observation balloons floated high, tethered to the earth by steel cables, their observers calmly noting the German advance and telephoning precise coordinates to French batteries. Within minutes, the skies over Champagne were alive with counter-barrages. Shells fell in curtains across the advancing columns, scattering men, horses, and equipment alike. Machine guns hidden in barns and cellars opened up from the flanks, turning lanes of approach into killing grounds. The fighting grew intimate and savage. In splintered vineyards and chalk quarries, French infantry launched counterattacks with bayonets, grenades, and raw determination. Hand-to-hand combat raged in ruined farmhouses, where walls shook with the concussion of grenades. Survivors later recalled the white dust of the Champagne plain clinging to uniforms until both sides looked like pale ghosts, locked in a struggle neither could escape. Despite their valor, the Germans could not break through. Gouraud's Fourth Army bent but did not snap. His famous pre-battle order, "We will be attacked. You have but one duty, to die on the spot rather than give way," was repeated across trenches, bunkers, and command posts. The men obeyed grimly, stubbornly, and with growing confidence as the day wore on. By nightfall, the German offensive east of Reims had bled itself white. Thousands of stormtroopers lay dead or wounded across ground they had captured only briefly. Prisoners stumbled to the rear in shock, many admitting that they had been promised French collapse, only to find resistance as strong as stone. Civilians emerged from cellars to survey new ruins, their city once again scarred but unbowed. The cathedral, though blackened and shattered, still stood its endurance, a mirror of France itself. Strategically, the attack on Reims had failed in its very purpose. It had not drawn French reserves away from the Marne. It had not broken morale. it had not deceived Foch. Instead, it had consumed precious German manpower and revealed that even their best troops could be stopped cold by a prepared defense. The French hold at Reims mattered far beyond its immediate sector. It gave the Allies time, steadied their confidence, and marked yet another point at which the German gamble unraveled. To the soldiers who fought there, it was proof that the nightmare of 1914 German armies marching unchecked toward Paris would not be repeated. To Ludendorff, it was the first unmistakable sign that his last throw of the dice was slipping from his grasp. The Marne had not yet been won, but at Reims, the Germans had already lost their chance at victory. If the diversion at Reims was a bloody stalemate, the German crossing of the Marne was something darker, a vision of annihilation. This was the centerpiece of Ludendorff's plan, the thrust that was meant to cut open the Allied line and carry German divisions south toward Paris. For the soldiers who waded into the river on July 15, 1918, it began with hope and confidence. By nightfall, the Marne had become a graveyard. The preparations had been meticulous. German engineers worked through the night, dragging pontoons down to the water's edge, hammering planks together by the fitful glow of lanterns. They lashed barrels into makeshift rafts, built narrow bridges under firelight, and whispered encouragement to the stormtroopers waiting to cross. Officers told their men that the French were broken, that the southern bank was undefended, and that Paris itself might soon be within artillery range. To weary soldiers who had fought since March, the prospect of victory felt intoxicating. At dawn, thousands surged forward. Some clambered onto pontoons, rifles slung across their shoulders. Others waded waist-deep water, soaking their packs as they stumbled through the current. From the northern bank, entire battalions moved in column across flimsy wooden bridges that swayed under their weight. To those in the ranks, the eerie silence from the far shore seemed like confirmation the Allies had fled. One lieutenant radioed back triumphantly, "The crossing is secure." For a few fleeting hours, it appeared Ludendorff's gamble was working. But silence can deceive. Along the southern bank, Allied troops crouched in hidden dugouts, machine gun barrels resting on sandbags, artillery crews waiting by calibrated guns. Their orders had been agonizing hold fire until the river was full, until the Germans were fully committed. The discipline required was inhuman. An American private recalled later, "We heard them talking, clinking their rifles together. My hands shook on the trigger, but the order was to wait. It was like watching a nightmare walk towards you." Then came the moment. A single rifle shot cracked out from the hedgerows. Another followed, and then the entire riverbank erupted in fire. Hundreds of machine guns, carefully concealed, opened up in unison. Their stuttering roar scythed across the pontoons, cutting men down mid-stride, shredding wood and flesh alike. Whole platoons collapsed where they stood. The river boiled with chaos as men thrashed in the water, drowning under the weight of their gear, their cries lost in the thunder of the barrage. Artillery joined the slaughter. French and American gunners who had remained silent during the bombardment now unleashed shells directly onto the crossing sites. Explosions churned the water into geysers of mud and flame. Pontoons splintered into fragments, bridges vanished in showers of sparks and smoke, and bodies floated downstream, lifeless past comrades, still struggling to reach the shore. Horses screamed as they were struck, their carcasses dragged under by the current. For those who survived the crossing, the southern bank offered no safety, only shallow foxholes raked by fire from every direction. The Americans of the 3rd Division fought with a tenacity that stunned their German adversaries. Positioned at Château-Thierry, they refused to yield an inch. Waves of stormtroopers came at them again and again, only to be driven back by disciplined rifle volleys and the ceaseless hammer of machine guns. Their commander declared, "We will hold here," and they did. From that day forward, the division bore the name Rock of the Marne, a title earned in blood. French troops fought shoulder to shoulder with their American allies, launching local counterattacks that shattered any attempt to consolidate the bridgeheads. At Dorman's German battalions tried repeatedly to dig in, but each advance disintegrated under a storm of shells. Machine gun nests hidden in orchards and barns caught attackers in crossfire. By evening, German units were no longer advancing, they were fighting simply to avoid extermination. For the men trapped on the wrong side of the river, the sense of betrayal was overwhelming. They had been told the French were broken, that Paris was near, that this was the strike to end the war. Instead, they dug into the muddy bank like hunted animals praying for nightfall. A Saxon officer, his diary later found on his body, wrote, "We crossed believing we were victors. Now, the water is filled with our comrades. God help us, there is no way back. The river itself bore silent witness. Once a pastoral waterway winding through vineyards, the Marne now carried wreckage and corpses in its current. Dead horses floated alongside shattered rafts. Uniforms of grey, blue and khaki tangled together in grotesque heaps along the banks. The air reeked of smoke cordite and the copper tang of blood. Soldiers who had dreamed of marching to Paris now crouched in flooded foxholes, reduced to trembling survivors of a massacre. By nightfall on July 15th, Ludendorff's great thrust had failed to break the line. His men held precarious positions south of the river, but at a staggering cost. Thousands had drowned, been mown down, or blown apart before they could even raise their rifles. The Marne, which in 1914 had saved France by halting Germany's first drive on Paris, had once again become a river of salvation, but this time it saved France by destroying the very army that tried to cross it. For the Allies, the day's defense was more than a tactical victory. It was proof that preparation discipline and combined arms could blunt even Germany's most determined assault. For the Germans, it was the beginning of despair, the realization that their last gamble had not opened the road to Paris, but had instead condemned thousands to a watery grave. The Second Battle of the Marne was far from over, but on that first terrible day, the balance of the war had already begun to shift. The river of death had claimed its toll, and the German dream of victory was already sinking beneath its surface. Behind the thunder of the guns and the clash of men on the Marne, another battle raged, quieter, less visible, but no less desperate. It was fought not with rifles and shells, but with bandages, morphine, and hands calloused by endless labor. This was the war of the stretcher-bearers, medics, surgeons, and nurses, who confronted the human wreckage of industrial slaughter. If the front lines were a furnace of destruction, the aid stations and field hospitals were crucibles of endurance where compassion and exhaustion clashed hour by hour. The stretcher-bearers were the first to enter the maelstrom. Moving in pairs or teams of 4, they crept into shell-torn fields under fire, their only weapons the canvas slings they carried. They bent their backs beneath the weight of broken bodies, stumbling over craters, ducking as bullets whistled overhead, wading through mud slick with blood. Each trip was an act of faith that they could reach a comrade before he bled out, and faith that they themselves would not be cut down before they returned. Many never came back, yet they went out again and again, driven by duty and by the knowledge that in this war, survival often depended less on courage in battle than on the men willing to drag you back from no man's land. The wounded they carried presented every horror the modern battlefield could inflict: limbs torn away by high-explosive shells, faces seared by mustard gas, skin blistered, and eyes clouded with blindness, chests ripped open by shrapnel bellies, punctured by bayonets. Some were mercifully unconscious, their minds spared the agony. Others screamed, begged, or wept uncontrollably, as morphine syringes failed to dull their pain. Medics worked beside the bearers, applying tourniquets, pouring iodine into wounds, or scribbling notes to pin on uniforms brief diagnoses to guide the surgeons farther back. Theirs was medicine, on the edge of chaos, performed with shaking hands in ditches and ruined barns. At the regimental aid posts, the flood of casualties never ceased. Set up in cellars, stables, or shattered farmhouses, these stations reeked of antiseptic and blood. Straw on the floor was quickly saturated until it squelched underfoot. Doctors, their sleeves rolled high and their faces smeared with sweat and grime, moved from one patient to the next, performing rough triage. The decisions were merciless but necessary. Who could be saved? Who must wait? Who was already beyond help? Those deemed hopeless were set aside, offered only morphine or a priest's final blessing. For them, the war ended in a quiet corner, far from the shouting of the front. Surgery under these conditions was brutal. Amputations were performed on rough wooden tables, the rasp of saw against bone, a sound that survivors never forgot. Anesthesia was scarce, often reduced to chloroform that dulled but did not erase the pain. Surgeons worked for hours without pause, their hands cramping, their eyes bloodshot, their minds numbed by the sheer volume of shattered flesh. Some collapsed at their workstations, only to be shaken awake by orderlies who needed them to continue. In these improvised theaters, medicine was less about healing than about preventing death by minutes, holding off infection, buying time. The nurses, many of them volunteers from across France, Britain, and America, bore burdens as heavy as any soldier. They washed wounds, spooned water into parched mouths, and whispered comfort into ears deafened by shell fire. They wrote last letters for men too weak to lift a pen, their neat handwriting carrying final messages across oceans and borders. They sat beside the dying, refusing to leave them alone in their last moments. One American nurse later recalled, "They were so young, so many of them, they begged us not to let go of their hands. We stayed until their eyes closed, and then we went on to the next bed because there were always more waiting." Psychological wounds filled the wards as well. Soldiers stumbled in, trembling, their eyes wide with shock, unable to speak or move. Some screamed at every noise, convinced another barrage was coming. Others crouched in corners, covering their heads, as if shells still rained down. Doctors called it shell shock, a phrase that seemed too simple for what it described: men whose spirits had shattered under the ceaseless strain of war. There were no real treatments, only rest, silence, and the faint hope of recovery. Many never found it. The scale of suffering overwhelmed every system. Convoys of ambulances, motorized and horse-drawn alike, clogged the roads leading away from the Marne. Inside, wounded men groaned with each bump and rattle. Some died before reaching the hospitals farther back. Those who survived the journey were delivered to sprawling base wards where hundreds of cots lined the floors in endless rows. In those cavernous spaces, the enormity of the battle was laid bare, an ocean of broken youth, their lives altered forever by minutes spent on the riverbank or in a wheat field. And yet, amid the despair, humanity endured. Chaplains and rabbis moved from bed to bed, offering blessings and listening to confessions. Fellow soldiers visited their wounded comrades, sharing cigarettes or simply sitting in silence. Letters written by medics and nurses carried home the final words of men who would never see their families again. For mothers, wives, and sisters far from the front, those letters became sacred relics, tokens of sacrifice inked in the hands of strangers who had held their loved ones at the edge of death. The wounded and the healers were bound together in this grim bargain of survival. Their battle did not appear on maps or in official bulletins, but it was as vital as any maneuver of divisions. The Second Battle of the Marne was decided not only by traps sprung and counterattacks launched, but also by the men who carried stretchers into fire and the women who sat at the bedsides of the dying. Their courage was quieter, but it was courage all the same, and without it, even victory would have been hollow. By the evening of July 17th, the momentum of Ludendorff's offensive had drained away. The Germans had hurled themselves across the Marne with ferocity, but the river crossings had been mauled, the assault at Reims had failed, and the stormtroopers who had fought so hard now clung to shallow bridgeheads, disorganized and bleeding. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, watching from his headquarters, judged that the moment had come. He had waited patiently while the Germans overextended themselves, and now, with their forces caught in the open, he prepared to deliver the blow that would change the course of the war. The plan was daring in its simplicity. Rather than merely shoving the Germans back across the river, Foch would strike at their exposed flank to the west, near Soissons. The very ground that Ludendorff believed secure would become the site of his undoing. For days, French, American, and British divisions had been shifted under cover of night into the dense forest of Villers-Cotterêts. Tanks camouflaged beneath nets and foliage were hidden in the woods. Artillery pieces were carefully registered on their targets, their barrels concealed by leafy branches. The deception was so thorough that German reconnaissance, increasingly harried by Allied aircraft, failed to detect the storm gathering just miles away. At dawn on July 18th, the storm broke. Unlike the great preliminary bombardments that had so often telegraphed attacks, the Allies opened with a sudden rolling barrage that caught the Germans completely off guard. Nearly 1,000 French guns fired in precise coordination, their shells falling like a curtain just ahead of the advancing troops. Villages along the Soissons-Château-Thierry line vanished in plumes of smoke and dust. German officers, roused from their sleep, stumbled out to find their positions collapsing under the weight of an assault they had not anticipated. Then came the infantry. General Charles Mangin's French 10th Army led the way, its ranks stiffened by the fresh energy of the American 1st and 2nd Divisions. Mangin, nicknamed the Butcher for his relentless aggression, had long advocated attacking with every resource at once. On this day, his doctrine was vindicated. At his side rolled hundreds of Renault FT tanks, smaller and more maneuverable than the lumbering giants of earlier years, but deployed now in swarms. Their steel hulls ground through barbed wire, their cannons silencing machine gun nests that had dominated the battlefield since 1914. The Germans, stunned by the suddenness of the assault, scrambled to resist. Machine gun crews fought desperately, mowing down waves of attackers in wheat fields, ripening under the July sun. But the tanks pressed on their armor, shrugging off rifle fire, their tracks crushing trenches into rubble. American troops advanced with reckless determination, storming villages at bayonet point, hurling grenades into basements and barns where defenders had holed up. At Vaucastille and Missy-aux-Bois, entire companies fell within minutes, but the survivors kept moving, driven by an almost furious resolve. A French officer watching the doughboys charge headlong into fire remarked, "They fight like lions, but they bleed like men who have not yet learned caution." Overhead, Allied aircraft swarmed. Fighters strafed German convoys on the roads, scattering men and horses in panic. Bombers dropped fragmentation bombs on crossroads and bridges, choking off reinforcements. Observation planes circled like hawks, directing artillery fire with uncanny accuracy. For the first time on this scale, all the instruments of modern war infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft moved in concert, a symphony of destruction that the Germans had no answer for. By midday, the results were catastrophic for the defenders. Whole regiments collapsed under the weight of the assault. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered rather than be annihilated, streaming to the rear with their hands raised, their faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. Mangin's men captured miles of ground and hundreds of guns in a single day, a feat almost unthinkable after 4 years of static trench warfare. Reports filtered back to Ludendorff of units, breaking of the right flank, buckling of a disaster in the making. The psychological shock was immense. For 4 years, Germany had dictated the pace of the war, launching offensives that kept the Allies reeling. Now, in a single day, the initiative had shifted. Ludendorff himself later admitted that the blow of July 18th shook me to the core. He knew then, though he would not yet confess it publicly, that the war was lost. For the Allies, the counterattack was more than a victory on the map. It was proof that the stalemate could be broken, that with fresh American strength and coordinated tactics, the great trench lines could be shattered. Soldiers who had endured years of futility now advanced with purpose. French morale, battered since 1917, surged with new life. American troops, though bloodied, had proven themselves. The British, though less involved in this particular sector, recognized that the tide had turned in their favor at last. By nightfall, the Germans were reeling. The Marne, once envisioned as the road to Paris, had become the scene of their undoing. Foch's counterattack had transformed a desperate defense into the beginning of a relentless advance. From this day forward, the German army would retreat step by step, river by river, until there was nowhere left to go but home. The Second Battle of the Marne was not yet finished, but July 18th marked the moment it ceased to be a German gamble and became an Allied triumph. The tide of the Great War had turned, and history would never flow the same way again. If July 18th marked the unleashing of Foch's counterstroke, the struggle for Soissons in the days that followed became its crucible. It was here, amid ridges, orchards, and stone-built villages, that the Allies drove hardest against the German right flank. The assault was not the swift, sweeping breakthrough that commanders dreamed of. It was a grinding fight, measured in yards gained and lives lost, where every wall and hedgerow became a fortress, and every field a killing ground. The terrain around Soissons favored the defender. Small farms and villages dotted the rolling countryside, their stone houses and barns quickly transformed into machine gun strongpoints. The Germans, though reeling from the shock of Mangin's initial blow, dug in with the discipline of veterans. Stormtroopers fortified cellars, mounted machine guns in church towers, and waited behind loops of barbed wire strung through orchards, heavy with summer fruit. They knew they were holding the hinge of the salient, the keystone of Ludendorff's entire plan. If Soissons fell, the right flank would unravel. Into this maelstrom surged the French 10th Army and its American allies. At dawn, columns of Renault FT tanks clanked forward across wheat fields, already scorched by shellfire. Their engines growled, their small cannons barking at nests of defenders. Infantry followed in their wake, bayonets fixed, hearts pounding. American divisions, the 1st and 2nd, were thrown into the line with little rest, their officers urging them on with cries of encouragement and curses alike. Forward, forward. Paris is behind us. The tanks created shock, but they were not invincible. Many bogged in shell craters or broke down after only a few miles. German gunners dragging field pieces into place with desperate haste knocked others out with direct fire, turning steel beasts into blazing hulks that littered the countryside. Survivors crawled from their wrecks to fight on foot, their armored confidence reduced to rifle and bayonet once more. The idyllic fields around Soissons soon became a graveyard for men and machines alike. The Americans fought with reckless energy. At Bercy-le-Sec, doughboys stormed into the village streets, clearing houses room by room with grenades and trench knives. At Vaucastille, entire platoons charged across open ground, swept by machine gun fire, collapsing in heaps, yet pressing forward through sheer determination. Their French allies, veterans of Verdun and the Chemin des Dames, watched in awe and concern. A French officer later wrote, "They fight like lions, but they bleed like men who have not yet learned caution." The cost was appalling. In just 3 days of fighting, American divisions lost over 12,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. French regiments suffered no less. The cries of the wounded echoed across fields, littered with burning wagons and dead horses. Stretcher-bearers stumbled through smoke-choked streets, lifting shattered bodies from the rubble of collapsed houses. Civilians who had not fled crouched in cellars, praying as grenades exploded in the rooms above their heads. Artillery thundered without pause. Allied guns laid down rolling barrages to cover each advance, while German batteries answered with counter-barrages that shattered roads and villages indiscriminately. The air filled with the drone of Allied aircraft fighters strafing convoys, bombers targeting crossroads, and observation planes circling high, directing the guns with uncanny accuracy. German pilots fought back, but they were outnumbered, and the skies above Soissons belonged to the Allies. By July 20th, Mangin's assault had driven 6 miles deep into German lines, capturing thousands of prisoners and dozens of guns. The salient, once a proud symbol of German ambition, had become a trap closing around its own army. German units withdrew in disorder, some surrendering in groups, others fighting to the last bullet before being overrun. The city of Soissons itself became a battlefield of smoke and ruin. Its medieval churches crumbled under shell fire, its streets clogged with rubble and corpses. Soldiers described the stench of decay, mingling with the sweet scent of crushed grapes from the ruined vineyards, a grotesque reminder of the land's lost abundance. For the Germans, the struggle for Soissons was a bitter revelation. They had believed that the Allies were still reeling from months of offensive blows, that the Americans were untested boys, that French morale was brittle. Instead, they faced tanks grinding through their wire aircraft circling overhead, and fresh divisions storming their defenses with reckless courage. Prisoners confessed their despair freely. Food was short, morale shattered, the sense of invincibility gone. For the Allies, the price was staggering, but the reward was undeniable. They had not only regained ground lost in the spring, but had forced the enemy into retreat. The German right flank was broken. Foch's counterattack was working. The initiative long monopolized by the Reich now belonged to the Allies. Soissons was not the end of the battle, but it was the hinge upon which the Second Marne turned. In the fields and ruins of that city, the German dream of a decisive victory collapsed into mud and blood. From that moment on, Ludendorff's army would fight not for triumph, but for survival. The fall of Soissons was more than the loss of a city. It was the breaking of the keystone that held up Ludendorff's entire offensive. Once Mangin's armies, reinforced by the reckless energy of the Americans, had driven deep into the German right flank, the shape of the battle changed irreversibly. What had begun as a thrust toward Paris was now unraveling into a retreat toward the Vesle. The German army, which had gambled its best divisions on this last offensive, found itself staggering under blows it could no longer withstand. The stormtrooper units, once the cutting edge of Germany's spring offensives, were gone. Decimated in March, April, and now July, these elite troops were shadows of their former selves. Companies were reduced to squads, regiments to scattered bands of men led by junior officers or even senior sergeants. The German 7th Army, tasked with holding the line around Soissons, no longer had the reserves or the strength to respond. Supply lines, already strained, collapsed under the weight of Allied pressure. Roads choked with wreckage, burning wagons, dead horses, overturned caissons, while Allied artillery, guided by aircraft overhead, rained destruction on every junction. Ammunition arrived too late or not at all. Rations were meager, often nothing more than a crust of bread and a thin soup. Hunger gnawed as cruelly as shrapnel. The retreat itself was anything but orderly. Villages became fortresses, held stubbornly by small groups of defenders, while the bulk of their comrades slipped away under cover of night. At Férentat-de-Noix, the ground changed hands multiple times in a single day, French tanks rumbling through orchards, only to be forced back by counterattacks. At Ouchy-le-Château, American units fought hand-to-hand in barns and cellars, bayonets slick with blood clearing one strong point after another. Yet for every position one another lay ahead, defended by men who knew they were sacrificed simply to buy time. Exhaustion defined the German army now. Soldiers stumbled through mud and smoked their boots, worn to rags, their uniforms in tatters. Many were little more than boys conscripts of 15 or 16, their smooth faces streaked with grime and fear. Allied interrogators recorded prisoners, admitting they had not eaten properly in days. Older veterans spoke openly of despair. "We fight only because we are ordered," one confessed. Desertion grew common. Hundreds surrendered willingly, some even waving white cloths as they approached Allied lines, their eyes hollow with hunger and hopelessness. Yet the German army was not without its moments of defiance. Machine gun crews held ridgelines until the last round, mowing down attackers before being overwhelmed by grenades or tanks. In fleeting, almost anachronistic moments, cavalry reappeared, French dragoons and colonial horsemen, charging through gaps in the retreating lines, scattering soldiers who no longer had the will to resist. But these flashes of resistance could not halt the tide. The land itself reflected the collapse. Heavy rains turned the fields into sucking quagmires. Horses drowned in ditches. Corpses lay half submerged in water-filled craters, faces, bloated helmets floating beside them. The stench of decay hung in the air, mingled with smoke from burning villages set ablaze in hasty German attempts at scorched earth. Civilians who had remained through the shelling stumbled into the open, dazed and hollow-eyed, watching armies flow past their ruined homes in both directions, Allies pressing forward, Germans slipping back. By the end of July, the German retreat had carried them across the Vesle River. Bridges were blown behind them, but the effort was rushed. Allied patrols entered abandoned camps to find half-eaten meals still on tables, rifles stacked, and left behind letters scattered across the floor. These were not the traces of a disciplined repositioning, but of an army in flight. Ludendorff himself later admitted that the shock of July 18th and the retreat that followed convinced him the war could no longer be won. For the Allies, the collapse of the German right was more than a battlefield success. It was vindication. After years of stalemate and slaughter, soldiers who had spent years crouched in defensive misery now advanced across open country, morale soaring despite the cost. For the French, it was proof that their army, bloodied but unbroken, could still strike decisively. For the Americans, it was baptism by fire, their reckless courage paying dividends at staggering human cost. And for the Germans, it was the shattering realization that the tide had turned permanently against them. The salient that had once promised victory was gone. The Marne, once envisioned as the road to Paris, had become instead the graveyard of German hopes. From the collapse of the right flank at Soissons onward, the Reich would never again seize the initiative. The retreat had begun, and it would not end until the war itself was over. By late July, the Second Battle of the Marne had shifted from the sharp thrust of attack and counterattack into something more grinding and miserable. The German gamble had failed, the Allied counteroffensive had seized the initiative, and now the fighting degenerated into a relentless pursuit across a battlefield that seemed determined to consume both sides. Mudfire and exhaustion became the defining features of this final phase, stripping away illusions of glory and leaving only survival in its most brutal form. Rain fell heavily in the last week of July. Shell-churned fields, already cratered beyond recognition, turned into vast quagmires. Soldiers on both sides sank ankle-deep, then knee-deep, until their boots were sucked from their feet and left behind in the muck. Tanks, the mechanical hope of the Allies, bogged down one after another, their tracks spinning uselessly before engines sputtered into silence. Horses collapsed mid-pull, drowning in ditches filled with rainwater and corpses. The mud seemed to take everything indiscriminately, men, animals, machines, pulling them down into its grasp, as if the very earth had grown hungry. The advance itself was a series of small, bloody contests for ruined villages and ridgelines. At Fère-en-Tardenois, fighting swirled through rubble-strewn streets. Houses collapsed under shellfire, burying both attackers and defenders. The village changed hands multiple times in a single day, each exchange, leaving the ruins more desolate than before. At Ulchy-le-Château, orchards became mazes of barbed wire and machine gun nests where men crawled on their bellies through mud grenades, clenched in their fists, trying to silence defenders hidden in cellars. Gains were measured not in miles but in yards, each bought with appalling sacrifice. The German rearguards fought with grim skill. Machine gun crews, knowing they were condemned, held positions until the last man, buying precious hours for their comrades to retreat. Some were wiped out by tanks crushing their strongpoints, others by grenades hurled through shattered windows. Yet their stubbornness turned every advance into a trial. Allied soldiers pressed forward through wheat fields flattened into slick mats, advancing over the bodies of comrades who had fallen minutes earlier. One French sergeant later wrote, "It was not war. It was survival against mud, against hunger, against the guns that never ceased." Disease thrived in the sodden camps. Lice infested every seam of clothing. Dysentery spread through units weakened by fatigue and spoiled rations. Stretcher bearers waded through waist-high water to reach the wounded, only to find some drowned in shell holes before help could arrive. The wounded who made it back to aid posts often died anyway, their bodies too weakened to resist infection. The mud was not merely an inconvenience, it was a killer in its own right. Civilians who had survived the shelling faced new horrors. Those who emerged from cellars found their homes obliterated, their fields poisoned by gas shells, their wells filled with debris or corpses. Families wandered the countryside carrying bundles of possessions, searching for relatives, begging soldiers for scraps of food. The countryside of Champagne, once famed for its vineyards and villages, had become a wasteland where even the living seemed half buried in mud and grief. And yet the orders were relentless. From headquarters far behind the lines came the same command advance, hold, attack again. For Allied soldiers, the knowledge that the enemy was retreating offered some encouragement, but the cost dulled even victory. The dead lay unburied in fields churned daily by shellfire. The cries of the wounded echoed across no man's land through the night, unanswered until dawn, when stretcher parties could risk the open ground again. Victory itself tasted bitter when purchased with so much blood. For the Germans, retreat offered no relief. Soldiers staggered northward, hollow-eyed, their uniforms in tatters, their boots in rags. Many carried only a few cartridges, some none at all. Prisoners captured in droves admitted they had not eaten properly, in days that morale was gone, that they no longer believed in victory. Entire companies melted away into the countryside, surrendering rather than continue the futile struggle. Yet the rearguards who remained behind continued to fight with mechanical discipline, forcing the Allies to bleed for every ruined village and sodden ridge. By the end of July, the battlefield was scarcely recognizable. Once a quilt of farmland, vineyards, and quiet hamlets, the land between the Marne and the Vesle had been reduced to a wasteland of shell holes, flooded trenches, and shattered trees. Soldiers trudged forward through landscapes where no birds sang and no crops grew, where the only sounds were the thunder of artillery and the groans of the dying. The Second Battle of the Marne was no longer about breakthroughs or maneuvers. It had become a test of endurance, fought not only against an enemy but against the very earth itself. Mud, fire, and futility defined those final days when men on both sides came to realize that in this war, victory itself could look and feel indistinguishable from defeat. By the first week of August 1918, the German retreat could no longer be disguised as a tactical withdrawal. What had begun 3 weeks earlier as Ludendorff's boldest gamble had collapsed into a disorganized flight toward the Vesle River, the last natural barrier south of the Aisne. The offensive that was supposed to end the war on Germany's terms had instead devoured its best divisions and left its armies exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. The Vesle now became less a defensive line than a refuge, a desperate hope that the retreat might be slowed before disaster became total. The Allies pressed relentlessly, French, British, and American units advanced step by bloody step, forcing crossings of their own over creeks and streams, battering German rearguards from villages and ridgelines. Tanks still rolled forward despite mechanical failures, their engines straining in the mud, their armor shrugging off small arms fire, as they silenced machine gun nests that had held up whole brigades. Allied aircraft swarmed overhead. The skies now belonged to them, and they used their dominance mercilessly, strafing columns on open roads, bombing bridges, and choking German supply routes, until the retreat resembled not strategy but panic. Every movement was reported to Allied artillery, which rained shells on crossroads and choke points, turning the German withdrawal into a gauntlet of fire. The retreating German columns told the story of collapse. Soldiers staggered along the roads, gaunt from hunger, their uniforms in tatters, their boots falling apart. Prisoners, taken in their thousands, confessed they had been given only scraps of bread for days, and many admitted openly that they no longer believed in victory. Among them were boys of 15 and 16 pressed into service as Germany scraped the bottom of its reserves, their smooth faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Older veterans, once the backbone of the army, trudged silently, hollow-eyed, carrying rifles. They no longer had the strength or will to fire. Civilians watched the retreat with a mixture of relief and despair. Villages south of the Vesle were liberated, but liberation revealed only ruin. Retreating Germans set houses alight, destroyed wells and poisoned water supplies in scorched earth tactics that left nothing for the returning inhabitants. Families emerged from cellars to find their homes reduced to blackened shells, their fields trampled and cratered, their livestock gone. Vineyards that had once given Champagne its name lay flattened, their vines burned or uprooted. Churches gutted by shellfires stood as empty skeletons over towns that no longer existed. Liberation was real, but it came at a cost that would scar the countryside for generations. The Allies advanced, but not without sacrifice. German rearguards fought with desperate skill. Machine gun teams positioned in ruined villages raked advancing infantry until tanks or grenades silenced them. Artillery, though retreating, still struck with harassing fire, catching Allied columns in villages they had just secured. Casualties mounted steadily, and Allied soldiers quickly learned that even a broken enemy could kill as efficiently as ever. Yet their morale surged regardless. After 4 years of holding, they were moving forward at last. For the first time, one French infantryman wrote, "We felt the war might end with us marching, not retreating." By mid-August, the German line had finally stabilized along the Vesle's northern bank. Bridges were blown as the last rearguards crossed, cutting off further pursuit. Yet the retreat had been too hasty to be complete. Allied patrols found German camps abandoned in chaos, meals half-eaten on tables, wagons mired in mud letters, scattered in haste, and piles of ammunition left behind. The message was unmistakable. This was not the measured withdrawal of a disciplined army, but the collapse of an offensive force that had gambled everything and lost. The Second Battle of the Marne had cost the Germans nearly 170,000 casualties, men they could not replace. The Allies had lost over 120,000, but their ranks were replenished by the unending stream of American divisions pouring into France each week. The arithmetic of war was now clear. Germany was spent, and the Allies were growing stronger every day. For Ludendorff, the Vesle was not a salvation but a pause, a place to gather the fragments of his broken armies and hope to delay the inevitable. He knew, though he would not admit it aloud, that his great gamble had failed utterly. The road to Paris had vanished. In its place stretched only a road of retreat, one that would lead step by step back to Germany itself. By August 6th of 1918, the thunder along the Marne and the Vesle had quieted. The Second Battle of the Marne, begun with Germany's last great gamble for victory, was over. What had started as a desperate thrust to split the Allies and seize Paris ended in retreat, ruin, and the collapse of German hopes. For the Allies, it was more than a victory. It was the pivot upon which the Great War turned. The cost was immense. German losses reached nearly 170,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Their elite stormtrooper units, painstakingly built and trained for the offensives of 1918, had been consumed. The Allies suffered over 120,000 casualties, including thousands of Americans whose first weeks in France became their last. In total, close to 300,000 men fell in just over 3 weeks of fighting. The figures alone were staggering, but they cannot capture the deeper devastation, the families torn apart, the villages erased, the countryside scarred. For Germany, the consequences were catastrophic. The Crown Prince, whose army group had led the attack, admitted to his father that his forces were finished as an offensive weapon. Ludendorff, shaken by the scale of failure, told his staff that the war could no longer be won. Soldiers surrendered in groups, their will broken. Some were barely more than boys, others veterans who confessed openly that they no longer believed in victory. On the home front, the news spread despite censorship. Strikes erupted, protests multiplied, and whispers of revolution grew louder. The empire's fabric, frayed by hunger and exhaustion, began to unravel. For the Allies, the battle was a renewal of faith. French morale, tested to the breaking point in 1917, revived. British soldiers, worn down by years of attrition, saw in the Marne proof that endurance had not been in vain. The Americans, though bloodied, had shown they could fight with ferocity and hold the line alongside the best of Europe's veterans. Most importantly, the Allies had discovered the formula for victory-coordinated attacks, with artillery, tanks, aircraft, and infantry working as one. The stalemate that had strangled the Western Front was broken. The land bore silent witness to the turning point. Vineyards lay flattened into wastelands. Orchards were reduced to blackened stumps. Villages were erased, their churches gutted, their cemeteries churned into craters. Reims cathedrals, scarred yet still standing, loomed over the ruins like a wounded sentinel. Families who returned found not homes but rubble, not fields but wastelands, not communities but graveyards. The Marne had twice saved France, in 1914, when German armies were halted at the gates of Paris, and in 1918, when those same armies broke themselves against the river's banks. Strategically, the Second Battle of the Marne opened the path to final victory. Within days, the Allies struck again at Amiens, launching the 100 Days Offensive that would drive the Germans back to their borders. From then until November, the Allies pressed relentlessly, each blow weakening an enemy already in collapse. The Marne was the beginning of the end, the moment when the war shifted irreversibly toward Allied triumph. Winston Churchill, writing of a later war, observed that before El Alamein, there were no victories, and after it, no defeats. The Second Battle of the Marne holds a similar place in memory. Before July 1918, the Allies endured setback after setback. After the Marne, momentum belonged to them, and Germany's road led only backward toward defeat and surrender. The battle was more than a clash of armies. It was the revelation of what modern war had become, a contest where machines and mass destruction overshadowed individual courage, where civilians suffered as much as soldiers, where entire landscapes were sacrificed for the sake of fleeting advances. Yet within the smoke and ruin, endurance triumphed. France held, the Allies struck back, Germany stumbled toward collapse. The Second Battle of the Marne was the last great German offensive of the war, and the first great Allied victory that pointed to its end. It was fought in mud, fire, and sacrifice, and it decided the future not only of nations, but of millions of lives. And so, more than a century later, its echoes still reach us. The Marne revealed the terrible cost of industrial war, where courage and suffering were measured against the relentless weight of machines. What lessons from 1918 still speak to us today? Share your thoughts in the comments.